This video clip will demonstrate common flow regimes that can be established inside pipes from horizontal orientation all the way up to a vertical orientation. This video was shot in the University of Texas Petroleum Engineering Flow Loop Lab over the summer 2012. The large diameter pipe on the top is a 7 1/4 inch internal diameter, and the smaller tube just underneath it is a 2 1/2 inch internal diameter. In the flow loop now, there is 628 barrels per day of water being pumped through the tubes, and the airflow rate is 0. You'll notice in the large tube on top that at 628 barrels per day, the tube is not full. There is an air gap on top. This flow is characterized with the name segregated flow, and it is stratified, meaning the heavier phase, in this case water, is on the bottom, the air is on the top. The small tube underneath is full, and you will see occasionally drifting by an entrained air bubble. Now 17 MCF per day of air is added to the 628 barrels of water per day. You'll notice in the upper tube that it remains a segregated, stratified flow pattern, but in the lower tube, you'll notice that we are now transitioning to a plug flow where you saw some large bubbles of air go by, and now we're transitioning into slug flow where frothy slugs are going to pass by. Now the air rate is increased to 200 MCF per day, and you will notice in the large tube a wavy pattern is beginning to be established, and in the lower tube we have even larger, longer intervals of the frothy air-water slugs passing by. Also notice in the large tube that the level of water has fallen down in the tube. This would indicate a decreasing liquid holdup in response to increasing velocities through the tube. The gas rate has now been increased to 300 MCF per day. You don't notice much of a change in the large tube. It is still a slightly wavy, segregated flow pattern. But in the small tube, the foamy air-water slugs now are going by faster, and they are more pronounced. The flow tube angle has now been increased to 14 degrees. The water rate remains 628 barrels per day, but the gas rate has been reduced to 70 MCF per day. What you see in the large tube is intermittent plug flow where bubbles of gas are moving along the top of the tube. And in the small tube, you see a stratified wavy flow where the waves are made up of long sections of foam. The gas rate has now been increased to 260 MCF per day, and you see the establishment of intermittent slug flow in the large tube. And in the small tube, you now see long, frothy slugs of foam. The flow tube has now been increased to a 45-degree angle and the gas rate reduced to 30 MCF per day. This produces a bubble flow moving up the upper side of the large tube, and stratified flow coming down the small tube. This is the same flow rate of the previous segment, just viewing it from the top, where you can see the bubble flow at the low gas rates moving up the upper side of the large tube and the segregated flow coming down the small tube. The gas rate has now been increased slightly so that the bubble flow in the large tube has transitioned to more of a churn pattern. In the small tube, you see that now there are some long waves of the foam moving down. The air rate has now been increased to 230 MCF per day, and we have established a slug flow regime in the large tube and a slug flow regime in the small tube. You'll notice that the slugs in the small tube are moving down at a rapid velocity. The slugs in the large tube are frothy slugs with liquid in between. This is a top view of the previous segment. The water rate is still 628 barrels per day and the air rate is 230 MCF per day. And you will see a series of pullbacks and close-up shots of the slug flow, particularly in the large diameter tube. In a moment, you'll see an interesting flow pattern where the slugs are moving by, but in between the slugs, you can see the water flowing back downhill until it collides with and is picked up by the following slug. The tube has now been picked up to a 90-degree or vertical orientation. This is at essentially zero gas rate. You will notice that there are a few bubbles moving up in bubble flow. This is particular to vertical flow. As we will see in the next segment, it doesn't take much of an increase in gas rate to change this bubble flow regime completely. The gas rate has only been increased to 8 MCF per day, and you'll notice a remarkable change. This is no longer bubble flow, this is a churn flow. This is the flow regime that predominates until the gas rate becomes quite large indeed. In a pipe of this diameter, the flow rate would have to exceed 3 million standard cubic feet per day before the churn flow would convert to something like an annular flow.